Welcome back, and we are into the last sort of session of our talks up until 8 o'clock. And I'm delighted now to introduce Imogen Rabone, who is coming from the Welsh border in England. And many of you might have had the trees on the land tree parcels delivered to you. And Imogen is the founder and coordinator of that project. And it was a cross-border project across the 32 counties here. She works with tree cover and woodland establishment and management projects across Ireland, Northern Ireland, and parts of England and Wales. And she's going to talk about agroforestry, an ancient concept, reinstating farm tree cover. And she's going to talk for about half an hour. And then, of course, we're going to have some time afterwards for questions and answers. So please do get them in now. And we'll put as many of those questions to her as possible, and use hashtag agroforestry as well if you're on social media. Imogen, thanks for joining us.
Hello. Thank you for having me. Shall I begin? I'll just share my screen. This can be a bit of always a little bit dodgy. Here we go. Share. Sorry, everyone, just bear with me.
That's great.
There we go. That's arriving. Okay, hi everyone. My name's Imogen Rabone. You probably already know that. I founded and I still coordinate the Trees on the Land project, which I think some of you might have come across over the last number of years in Ireland and Northern Ireland. I'm going to talk a little bit about the project and what we aim to achieve and what we do. And then I'm going to have a little look back in time at some of the roots of some of these agroforestry models we've been discussing in the last few days. And I believe very strongly that most of what we talk about with agroforestry has very ancient foundations. So that's where this particular talk is at. Trees on the Land was conceived about 10 years ago. It was a response to the forestry program of the time. The focus then, as it tends to be now, it was very much on larger areas of forestry, monocultures of exotic conifers, and with native woodland a little bit of an afterthought. At the time, there was a gap in the REPS and AOS schemes. So there was very little option for farmers who wanting to do any tree planting on their ground. And for any landowners, actually, there was very little support out there. I come from a farming background in England, where trees and hedges and scrubland, they're all very much a valid part of the farm and part of the farming year, managing them. And I was quite baffled when I came to Ireland to study that there was a very narrow view of forestry in Ireland, particularly policy-wise. So I set out really to test the water and to see what schemes might work and to add what could be added in somewhere in the gap between forestry and I suppose garden tree planting. There seemed to be a vast gap in between there. And certainly a lot of the farm tree cover was disappearing nearly faster than it was reappearing. So we started out in, I think, 2012. Our first planting was 2013, and we started out offering bags of 50 trees to farmers, landowners, smallholders, schools, colleges, community groups, sports clubs, golf clubs, all different landowners. And trees were packed in mixed bundles for hedgerows, woodlands, coppice, shelter belt, orchards, and various other sort of establishment mixes that we sent out. Initially, I was told the whole thing would be a complete disaster, and it jolly nearly was. And certainly I was told that farmers would not be interested. And that was my real aim, was to engage farmers that first year that we started out. I suppose I'm glad to say, or at least I'm sorry to say, that we had about, 3,000 inquiries in the first week or two after we launched, and it jolly nearly sunk us. And I still have nightmares about trying to manage all those inquiries. I know that a lot of farmers got lost along the way, and it was pretty much chaos. On the good side, we did manage to deliver the trees, and most people got their trees. And we started to sort of focusing then much more on farm work. And the main gap I saw was the small scale work. A lot of farmers who wanted to fill in a gap in a hedge, for example, or to put a small copse of 10 trees in a paddock where there might have been trees before, they were really stuck as to where to get hold of trees and where to source decent tree planting material. You could go to a garden nursery and buy very expensive imported native trees. Mostly they're grown too big to transplant into a farm scenario, and they cost half the earth. Or you could go through the forestry proper, through the grant schemes. Or you could look at wholesale buying of native trees. But again, people were very limited. You had to really commit to 1,000 or more trees. And that was quite intimidating, I think, for a lot of farmers who just wanted to do a little bit here and a little bit there. So I worked at getting hold of strong supplies of native trees grown in Ireland from Irish seed. Provenance was key for me. I didn't want to be messing around importing trees, and indeed we still avoid that at all costs. And to make up these very tough, hardy mixes that would grow nearly anywhere and give you your hedgerow or your woodland or your copse or your shelter belt in a pack, ready to go, nice strong trees. That's developed now. We look after about 1,000 landowners a year seems to be where it's at the moment. Anything in the region of 250,000 trees or upwards go out from us each year. And we give a lot more detail now to our farmers. About 80% of that 1,000 people would be farmers. So that's where the majority of our work is. We've done a lot of experimental agroforestry work over the years. We've got trials in all sorts of pockets and corners, and we do a lot more farm tree planning now with farmers, where we go into a lot of detail and plan quite large scale projects. Some of our projects now have maybe 10 or even 20,000 trees on the farm without impacting on productive acreage. So there's a lot more detail now than there used to be, but really the bread and butter is the small farms taking small packs of trees, maybe only 20 or 50 trees each year to do small areas. And the vast majority of that is hedgerow restoration. That's really where a huge number of our trees go into hedgerows and restoring little odds and pockets and corners of trees on farmland. I've always felt that agroforestry is a really obvious path for sustainable farming and also for reaching forest and tree cover targets. There's a lot of grey area between forestry and tree cover in Ireland, but agroforestry is certainly something that I've believed in for a long time. And I think it gets seen as quite a futuristic or scientific concept, where it isn't. I think it's, there's a lot of stuff we can just look at on the slideshow that I haven't started properly yet. There, a lot of those scenarios are very familiar to us if we just look at a picture of the landscape. So I aim always to take the broadest view I can of tree planting, and to support farm work in as many ways as we can manage. There's so many ways to plant trees. So it's really about keeping an open mind and being there to support farmers and to make sure that what they're doing really is appropriate and manageable, and that the trees get in there and grow well. Now, please forgive my hopeless slideshow. I'm going to try and make it work. A word about, so from my view, agroforestry, there's a lot of big definitions going around. As far as I'm concerned, almost any tree planting on farms is agroforestry, and that includes hedges. It includes a little scrap of scrub in the corner. It's a very broad definition for me. We're told again and again that the world needs more trees, and more often than not, that's very much woodland and forestry focused. You ask anyone about trees, and I think they think straight away about wall-to-wall trees, blanket forestry, cheek by jowl, and they, what do we see in Ireland? We see Sitka spruce everywhere, so it's no surprise that that's what people think of. I spend a huge amount of time explaining to people that trees doesn't need to mean forestry, and that there are lots of different scenarios for trees to be included outside of forestry. High forest and that model of growing trees very close together to get the height and straightness and quality timber is it's really the only model we have in Ireland and the UK and in parts of Europe. And it's a real shame. It's not the best way, and it's certainly not the only way. So with agroforestry, we look at, when we're working with farms, the first thing we look at is what used to be there before. And I would encourage any of you who haven't already, any farmers amongst you, have a good look at the old OS maps. You can get them online, the old townland maps, the 1800s maps. A lot of them mark in every single tree. They mark in areas of woodland. You can see the land use, and they really are a fabulous resource. Some of the bigger farms and estates out there have even older maps that are more detailed. A lot of the time they reflect modernizations of the time. So they're nearly a picture of what just happened. A day doesn't go by when I don't wish we couldn't look back 1,000 years and see those old OS maps 1,000 years ago would be wonderful. But do always have a look at what's been on your ground before, and have a think. Often a mystery can be explained. A wet patch in the corner of a field might have been a series of ponds ploughed out. A rough bit of ground with nettles or bracken might have been trees before. A solitary tree in a field might have been a hedgerow, might have been the corner of a woodland. It's always really fascinating what you can find out. And then observe on the ground as well, soil marks, bumps in the ground, ridges in your field. There's so many things that indicate what might have been there before that you can then match to the maps. So certainly that's something that we always start with is go back in time and have a really good look at what was there before. And then with our farm plans, we then really look at what's there now. And any good conservationist will say always protect what you have before you start putting in anything new. I spend a lot of time talking about babies and bath water. It really breaks my heart to see older trees and scrub being pulled out to put new trees in. There's nothing worse, and certainly it's completely unnecessary. So we need to protect what we already have. So now on to just seeing if I can make, hedges. We start with hedges. It's pretty covered farms in Ireland and in the UK. I'm convinced that the bleaching and stock-proofing of hedges predates the enclosures and the times where we tend to think that hedging proper really began. I think that it's a far more ancient thing than that. Carving up a farm with complicated agroforestry systems is one thing. Talking about hedgerows is something where we often can break common ground with farmers and begin to talk about the hedgerows and what they already have there. Declines in hedgerows obviously massive in the last number of years. They're still declining, and I know ash dieback is a huge worry. Obviously, we're going to start seeing more and more damage, certainly in the west. I just can't bear to see what's happening with the ash we have in our hedges and open grown trees as well. Many of our hedgerows are also, they're the closest thing we have to our ancient woodlands in terms of species and the wildflowers associated with them. But often they are relic edges of old woodlands that were felled out and just leaving a wandering line of hedgerow that was never quite straightened out. You know, they really are important, and we can't afford to lose them, you know, through modernisation. The loss is losing them staggering again. You know, shelter, shade, soil protection, leaf litter, light brash. I've got a slide here. The leaf litter in this picture, that's just from a line of old hedgerow, and the leaf litter each season blows out, I don't know, probably 200 yards from the hedge, and we don't need to put any fertiliser on that field. It grows good grass all year round, and I'm fairly convinced that that's just the leaf litter and the light brash. There's a sneaky cherry tree growing in there that I might put a guard around and let it come up, or I'll let the cattle eat it. I don't know yet. Certainly leaf litter is a huge bonus. Wildlife, hedgerows are really one of our best ways of supporting wildlife. We go on about biodiversity, certainly in agroforestry. And really, if you take out your hedges, you're taking out the most ancient infrastructure that we have and a basis for wildlife of all kinds. So keep your hedges in mind. And plus they sequester carbon, which of course is really important these days and a big buzzword. I think we'll do well to mind our hedges. What can you do with your hedges? Lots of different management techniques, work with what you've got, perhaps look at flailing less often, flailing on a 2-year cycle, perhaps doing one side 1 year, one side the other year, or doing a rotation around the farm. Let some of your hedges grow up tall and establish a coppice rotation. The firewood that can come out of a coppice hedge is certainly not to be sniffed at with firewood prices as they are at the moment. Also laying hedges. Let me go back. It's a bit English of me, but certainly we're seeing a huge revival in Ireland in interest in hedge laying and properly done. Any farms wishing to do something a bit dramatic, let your hedges go for a few years and have them cut and laid, or indeed learn to do it yourself. Don't forget standard trees. It's so easy to let a standard come up out of your hedgerow just by missing a few trees when you're flailing. Or you can go and plant in a few and let them come up as standards, let them come up and be pollarded, but either way, the birds and the bats and your livestock will thank you for them, and they are really the icing on the cake with hedges. I often wonder if someone invented hedge laying today, we'd be talking all about it. It would be the big thing. It would be the next big thing on the conference here. Someone invented this marvelous living fence, and we still rely so much on post and wire. But I won't go on about that. Anyway, on to woodland. Woodland, really, the historical relationship between livestock and woodlands, I think, gets forgotten so much. You'd be in big trouble now if you grubbed out your woodland, and you'd equally be in big trouble if you just let your livestock in and to go wild. But most of our ancient woodlands were managed with livestock as part of the seasonal cycle. There was a lot of attention to detail. Compartments were marked out very clearly with banks and ditches. Dead hedging was used on a grand scale, and livestock was allowed in and excluded at different times. Pigs, cattle, horses, sheep were all run through woodlands to clear up brash, knock back brambles, and to have good keep from acorns and seeds. And remember that our woodlands were much more open probably than they are now. They weren't all geared to high forest, and so there was herbage in there. There was good pasture to be had in amongst the trees, and that's something that we've lost in our working woodlands. It was always certain traditional with planting woodlands in the last few hundred years. You plant a woodland, you plant a hedge around it, and then you have the flexibility of being able to protect the trees in the early years, protect trees after coppicing or after planting. And once they were up and away, then you could use your exclosure hedge as an enclosure and let the cattle in and let them start with a bit of side pruning and clearing the understory and the undergrowth a little bit. It's so sad that we really have lost the skills of knowing when to let them in and when to get them out again. But I was delighted to hear Eugene yesterday and Ian talking about the idea of reintroduction of grazing into woodlands. If you have established woodland and you're interested in grazing it, do ask your local inspector or Chagas advisors for advice. It's certainly not something I'd advocate to just let the animals in, but I think there's a glimmer of hope now with a little bit of return to grazing woodlands, which would be really exciting. But certainly woodland doesn't necessarily need to be the end of the line in terms of useful ground for livestock. Orchards, probably the easiest way to explain agroforestry to the uninitiated. Hang on, where are we going with our slideshow here? Oh no, I've lost my orchard slide, never mind. Productive fruit trees, standing over pasture with livestock running underneath, making use of the grass, nice and clean, using up unwanted windfalls, and another income stream, which I think is crucial for a lot of farmers these days. There's a lot of interest yesterday in fruit and nut trees. I think the reason for the 15% fruit and nut trees on the grants at the moment is probably cost and also availability. We've a number of trials running with walnut, cobnut, chestnut, all sorts of nuts and fruit trees as agroforestry. And I don't know how many of you knew Andy Wilson, who very sadly died at the end of last year. It was really sad. His research and work into nut trees for Ireland and fruit trees was phenomenal. And I fear that a lot of the good supply of trees that we had and a lot of the knowledge is going to be lost with him passing. So it's a very, very sad loss for the industry, especially as people are becoming more and more interested in agroforestry. So really, really sad thing. But we do a lot of work with restoring farm orchards. You know, they are an ancient concept and the scope is absolutely huge. So don't forget your orchards where they used to be. One, look at your old map, see where it was on the farm and consider putting it back in, even if you're not able to do agroforestry on any grand scale. It's always worth sticking in a few fruit trees. I have no idea how I'm doing for time here. Wood pasture. We've talked a lot about silvopasture in the last couple of days. It's the one system that's bound to work for Ireland with mostly livestock farms. The purists amongst us tend to prefer to use wood pasture as a kind of wilder and a woollier version of silvopasture. Most of our pasture in ancient times in Ireland and all across the UK would have been wood pasture. Open pasture, scattered open grown trees, pollards, scrub, little pockets of trees, all in there and all evolving. Wood pasture is a really precarious tension, and I think people forget that it's a tension between woodland and open grassland. You know, if you stop grazing your pasture, it will eventually turn to woodland. If you overgraze your woodland, it will eventually become a pasture. And that's the wonder of wood pasture, is that sort of tension existing. And the slide shot there that's some scrub that's only about 15, 20 years as that scrub has got up. Both sides of the fence, it's all scrub. We graze the whole lot of it and it's incredibly productive. We have firewood out of it. And you can just see some places we've just been doing a bit of side pruning in there to open it up a little bit and have some firewood out. Jim mentioned yesterday the extension of the grazing season, which is a huge one, up to 3 or even 4 months extension to the grazing season. 100 years ago or more, we didn't have the scope that we have now to house animals and feed them all winter. And certainly the pasture had to stand up to much more winter grazing than it does now. The grazing season had to be longer. And I think Clive and a lot of the different speakers have said enough about how brilliant it is to be able to keep your animals outdoors for longer and to keep your pasture in better nick ultimately, especially during times of drought and very wet weather. What next? Open grown trees. These are really a feature of wood pasture, but they're also they also stand alone, open grown. They were a common sight on pasture and tillage over the years. They're really rapidly disappearing and getting old and falling over. The tree in the picture here, the big oak tree on the left, it's probably only about 80, 90, maybe 100 years old. It's not as old as it looks. I measured the canopy this morning. It's 71 feet from east to west, which is about 21 metres. And that's grown up entirely unaided on the pasture. It's never been guarded. It's never been minded in any particular way. You can see where it forks quite low down. It was probably nipped off by a sheep when it was very, very young and probably nipped off again, which has caused that further branching. It's absolutely massive, and it just touches the canopy with that ash tree you can see on the right, which doesn't really show in the scale, but it's nearly as big, that ash tree. It's a magnificent tree. The current agroforestry schemes don't really allow for the very wide spacings, those two trees are 30 metres apart. And I do agree with the system to keep to 10 metres to allow for decent timber to be grown. But we're very focused on timber with agroforestry, and sure, if you need an income and I had to cut that oak tree down, I wouldn't dare to tell you how much firewood value there would be in it. But also the vast numbers of species living on it, birds, mammals, insects, fungi, and not to mention a shade for a herd of cattle and a herd of sheep underneath it. I think it's certainly worth every penny of it having been let grow there for free all by itself as part of our wood pasture project here. Note the dead hedge in the foreground. It looks like a laid hedge. It isn't a real hedge. It's entirely made of brash and dead wood. We use a lot of dead hedging to keep animals where we want them. That hedge is 2 years old, and I'd expect it to last 5 or 6 years if we look after it. There's a new hedge planted behind it. It's protecting a new hedge. And when the new hedge is up well enough to lay, we'll kick the old dead hedge in underneath it, or push it in as dead wood into the lay, and it will have served its purpose. But it certainly is stock proof at the moment, and it costs nothing in a day to put up. What else have we got here? Scrub. Oh no, hang on. Back to my scrub picture. I did have another scrub picture. So we've got a long way to go in Ireland, I think, to protect our scrub as it should be protected. It's really vital that the department sorts itself out about payments or not payments on scrub, and to bring some clarity for farmers. It's outrageous that farmers are penalised for allowing areas to scrub up, and similarly, it's outrageous that scrub clearance is the norm in order to keep your farm payment on a bit of ground. Again, I know Clive touched on that yesterday. Scrub's wonderful. It's not a waste of ground, and it's not waste ground. It's the first step to growing trees and woodlands. It will turn to woodland eventually, even if it's just a few birch seeds blown in. If we're all brave enough to leave a few patches of nettles and brambles, we'd soon have birch and thorn and oak and so on, if you've got tree seed nearby. It's the first step to wood pasture, and if you keep grazing it, you eventually get, as you can see here in this picture, the sort of tension between the pasture and the woodland. We've a lot of spinnies on our ground that we allow to come, and then we thin away, we let the animals in, and slowly they get crafted. The cherry trees you can see in the foreground, they're not perfect. There's a bit of rot in them, but they're both being kept on as potential saw logs one fine day. Scrub comes and goes. It's part of the shifting landscape. It's part of the rural landscape, and fields let go were historically reclaimed by grazing, maybe with burning and ploughing up. We don't tend to let land go fallow properly anymore. But I don't think it's something that farmers should feel frightened of or threatened by, and certainly I don't think they should be penalised for letting scrub areas come up. Again, it's an ancient part of, we didn't used to need to plant trees centuries and centuries ago. They would just come. And I think it's a real shame that we don't use our scrub better than we do at the moment. Now, a few more general points on coppice comes up a lot, and has done the last couple of days. That's not coppice. There's a bit of coppice. It's an open grown, it's a pretty ancient older tree. It's part of the series. We're on a lovely river here, which is flanked all the way for about 50 miles with ancient older coppice that is kept up and is managed. That one's gone a little bit over, but that will be cut probably in the next cycle. I think people tend to think that when you cut a tree down, it's gone forever, and it just isn't the case with broadleaf trees. They will grow back, and you get 5 or 10 for the price of one again and again and again. Most of our broadleaf trees will coppice well, and indeed grow very vigorously, and that cycle can be as short as a year for fodder coppice, for example, and as long as 10, 15, 25 years or more. It's phenomenally productive, and it's entirely overlooked in Ireland. I'm very glad to see a rising interest in it the last few years coming up through my project. I note that at the moment, I think there's a short rotation coppice scheme through the grants, but there's still a requirement that you grub up the stalls and replant them at the end of each cycle, which is complete madness. Coppice is very much valued timber in ancient times, in fact, more valued than big timber, than big sawlog timber, and was used for all kinds of building and certainly timber framing in buildings, even in parts of shipbuilding, with the big, tall, standard trees for sawmilling were only ever really reserved for the very biggest beams and ship spars and stuff. Even singling coppice, singling to maiden trees, we see a lot of it over here in England in our ancient woodlands. You know, a tree has an infinite life cycle if you can just keep it going and regrowing. So I'm delighted to see coppice coming much more to the fore in agroforestry, as I said, particularly for fodder. The modern systems where you cut a tree down and then you plant another tree in its place, and some of the very pious projects that claim to plant 1 or 2 trees for every tree that's felled, well, goodness me, if your woodlands are well managed, surely there's no need to replant at all. So I hope to see a real revival of coppice in the true ancient sense, both as woodland. I think that's we've lost the idea of our woodlands being quite low grown and regularly coppiced rather than being tall, high forest all the way. But also as open grown trees, you know, coppice is wonderful and easy to grow in the open air. I think there's a lot of talk that Ireland doesn't have a coppice tradition, but I think that's rubbish. I think something just went horribly wrong and we've lost most of it. But certainly in Wicklow, there's coppice bits and pieces. And I'm really, really glad to see it making a bit more of a comeback. Certainly some of our most ancient trees are coppice stalls and might have been cut 100 times in 1,000 years. It's really great to see it coming back, and it too has ancient roots. Pollarding, there we go, it's a nice willow pollard. Cut the top off a tree, and again we tend to think of it as killing it. I lived next door to a lady in Dublin who had an ash tree growing in her front garden, pretty much growing out of the wall, and every year she used to come out and cut it down, cut the top off it, try and kill it, and it would regrow with 100 poles and got bigger and stronger each year, and eventually I broke her wall down, but I was delighted with it. We have a lot of pollard interest coming up now, and if you get them young when they're maybe broom handle size, they really form a good bowling, and the growth again is phenomenal. They can be kept just out of reach of livestock, fabulous in an agroforestry scenario. You can have timber or firewood off them and fodder as well. They're just wonderful. And the key thing with pollards and with coppice as well, and really worth thinking about in agroforestry, is that option to manipulate your light levels, your ventilation levels, and your shelter levels. So in say a tillage scenario where you've got pollards or coppice working together in belts or alleys, you actually can coordinate a 3 or 4 year cycle where you're pollarding, taking out the shelter, bringing in the light and the ventilation for, say, a crop of barley that might want more ventilation than another crop, and then allowing it to regrow during subsequent rotations of different crops. So I think people think of trees as very permanent and very fixed, and there is so much that can be done on a very, very short rotations to manage that cover and manipulate it just how you want it, even taking it right down to the ground and letting it regrow over a number of years. All of the flexibility is there. I have no idea where we're at with time, but one more quick thing. Another ancient concept that we really do forget about is tree fodder. And again, I've seen it come up the last day or two, which has been great to see that come. There was a wonderful picture of some poplar coppice for fodder, which I was delighted to see. I have a picture here. It's not strictly cut tree fodder. There's one of our livestocks managing the browse line. our traditional livestock never did evolve to eat grass or grass and grain only. They're all browsing animals, cattle, sheep, well, pigs, horses, poultry. They all love a little bit of leaf if they can get hold of it. I think we're missing something in our modern nutrition, and certainly we know that eating leaves and twigs, there's a host of minerals and trace elements that aren't available in grass and grain diets for our animals. We know that tannins in twigs and branches are supposed to support natural deworming. There's a lot of ongoing research. But certainly the way animals really relish a bit of browse is sort of clear for most farmers to see that it must be good in one way or another. We have to be a little bit careful on species wherever we're cutting and drying fodder, either as coppice or as pollards, or just out of brash coming out of hedges. I'm quite particular about what species I offer to animals. In a wood pasture scenario, I let them have whatever they like. That's an oak tree. Lots of people will say oak trees are poisonous to horses. I don't worry about that. She's having it early in the season. There's no acorns around. She's loving that tree there. And in fact, she manipulates that. She only browses it every month or so. When the new growth comes, she goes and has a bit more. The same with the cattle. The sheep can't reach, sadly, but that's their tough luck. But poisonous species, we have a few bankers that I feel very confident drying and using as fodder hay, as tree hay. Ash, hazel, wych elm, oak, willow, hawthorn, holly. Very, very happy with all of those. Oak is controversial, as I said, but once there's no acorns on it, I don't worry a bit. I tend to use the fresher growth bits and bobs. Hazel are much preferred by all the animals, and wych elm is a big one. And holly, once you can get it high enough up the tree that it's not too spiky. So, yeah, tree fodder is a really ancient one that we tend to forget, and I'm delighted to see it coming back now, being talked about more and more. I had a great chat with a local farmer the other day who was asking me about my tree bothering work. He's very interested in nutrition. He's got an immaculate farm, beautiful old hedges around the edge, and then not a tree in the middle. Everything's post and wire. He's a very tidy farmer, and he asked me what he'd look at doing. And I took him down to his big meadow. He'd just let out some sheep and lambs, and the whole flock was lined up against his sheep wire fence with their toes tucked into the fence and their faces pushed through, browsing at the new growth on the hedge. His fields are immaculate. They've been fertilised, lined. There was always lush, fresh grass growth, and they have nothing to do with it. They were a big line along the hedge, having the browse off it. And he keeps asking me about eating hedges and how he can get more of those going. So that's a little bit about tree fodder, which again, ancient concept, delighted to see it making a comeback. One more thing. Oh yes, tree guards have been coming up a lot. My husband's allergic to wire. And that's absolutely necessary. So he likes making things out of wood. We're very lucky we do run a chestnut business, so we can get our chestnut, we can cleave it, we can get these guards up at cost. They are very expensive, but that guard, just for the record there, is 7 foot tall. And it's horse-proof, deer-proof, cow-proof, sheep-proof, rabbit-proof, hare-proof. I think voles would get through it, but that's about it. And I'm a big fan of allowing trees to get growing away. There's so much with these narrow tubex guards, or the wire guards. Almost any guard you think of will interfere with the tree in one way or another, whether it falls over and pulls the tree with it, whether it's rubbing on the bark. I see a lot of damage to form of trees from these very narrow guards. And the stakes, Jesus, 1 stake, 2 stakes, 3 stakes, they still go over. So extravagant though it is, that guard and the way it looks, there's just a tiny whisper of an oak tree in there that we found on the open pasture. It's open, it's come by itself, and there's just stuck a guard around it to let it come up. In the background there you can see some young scrub coming. I haven't topped the corner of that field because I dig those suckers up and use them for hedging elsewhere, so they are sort of actually receding rather than marching out over the pasture. But that's 2 years growth of scrub there that I need to get digging up next season. I think that's about all I've got to say. I'm so sorry if I've run over or been very short. Are you there?
Yes. Thanks, Imogen. That was just fascinating. And it's lovely to see parts of your farm as well. We've got quite a few questions and we don't have a huge amount of time, so we're going to fly into them.
Right.
Coppicing, I mean, it's interesting. I wonder to what extent you would suggest some form of training when it comes to coppicing. I mean, it's quite a skill.
It is quite a skill. And oh my goodness, if I could advocate for the Irish National Coppice Hedge and General Woodmanship Training School, I absolutely would. We should take 50 of the best students a year every year, and training is really where it's at. It's no good planting all these trees and no one knowing how to manage them. Certainly we need training, and there's a little bit of, look it up, get on with it, give it a go.
I was just about to say, I mean, I'm very mindful nowadays that there's nothing really that, you can't learn that isn't on YouTube. So, I mean, is it a case that if you just give it a go and have a bit of confidence about it, it's possible? Because we've had some questions about, courses and information about coppicing.
Yes, I mean, there are courses. I should put together an information sheet, but there are not enough in Ireland, and I would dearly love to see some proper funding put behind them. Let's put it that way. But sure, have a look on YouTube, get a book, learn. If you're ever watching stuff on YouTube, watch 10 different videos, get an idea of the different ways people do stuff. The rookie job soon becomes apparent. But absolutely, we need to be training young woodsmen all the way, and coppice would be right at the front of that.
And someone just asked, can whitethorn and blackthorn trees be coppiced?
Oh yes, my goodness, absolutely. They can be coppiced as well as anything, and some of the very best firewood, certainly that we sell a lot of firewood every year, would be hawthorn and blackthorn.
Lovely. Sean.
They coppice brilliantly.
Yeah, it would be very remiss of a training organisation like National Organic Training Scheme not to suggest that if people are interested in any training course of any type, but particularly around coppicing or agroforestry, that they drop us an email, and if we have sufficient demand, we will go and find somebody to deliver that. I always think that we're getting zoomed out nearly at the stage that it would be a great course to do in a practical element. So maybe even we could get recommendations from people who they would like to deliver training as well. So that's the thing. But when I have the chair, I'm going to ask Imogen, through a lot of the speakers today, they've mentioned witch elm. How are we on elm disease? Is it affected witch elm?
Yeah, it's a funny one. It is affected. It varies county to county, country to country. It seems to have been more slowly affected than the English elms. And certainly it's about in Ireland. It's in your hedgerows. It doesn't live as long as you'd like it to, similar to the English elm, which will often live to maybe 30 years in a woodland, and you suddenly find one and then it dies back and goes away. Elm suckers like mad, so it's always going to come back. It often won't die off entirely. And I actually have grown from seed. I put 2 buckets of seed, so probably several thousand seedlings into a bed. And I've got about 40 strong young wych elms come from those. So it can be grown from seed, but it's a devil to get it to go. But it is susceptible to the disease, but don't lose hope. I wouldn't be planting a woodland of it for sure, and you can't buy it. But don't give up on it entirely.
We had a nice comment from Ragna in County Clare who says, Imogen, thank you so much for your ongoing work. We were part of the first planting in 2013 with 5,000 tree strong woodland in Clare, and they are all growing well.
Oh my goodness, that was a grant-aided project, and oh my goodness, that's great to hear.
Can I ask you on your mention of the fact that the trees that you have in that scheme, that they are all from Ireland, and just a point about nurseries and Irish grown trees in general, because going into any commercial nursery or garden centre, a lot of it is Dutch.
Yeah, garden centre nurseries, it's always worth asking and double checking, but quite often they'll tell you it's native, meaning native and not Irish grown or from Irish seed. A lot of the bigger nurseries do carry stocks. It's really about asking. But there are good stocks of Irish grown stuff. It's relatively limited. People know that from our tree packs. That, you know, it varies year to year what we can actually get hold of. But certainly the usual suspects: birch, alder, oak, Scots pine, rowan, crabapple. There's hawthorn, blackthorn, hazel. They're usually more or less readily available.
Joe Garand asks, says, Grazing Ecology and Forest History by Franz Vera is a classic. Does it link with Imogen's perspective? And I suppose just in answering it, maybe give a few books that you would recommend people to read when it comes to this. I mean, it's a very general subject of trees, but ancient woodlands, and for inspiration.
Oh, golly, massive subject. Yeah, I mean, read Oliver Rackham. Read, I don't know, go and watch your livestock. You know, there's a lot of reading. I should probably fish out my book list here. I'm hopeless when I'm put on the spot. There's a lot to read, and maybe I should do a reading list for our website. Actually, it's something that people do ask us all the time. But I would say Rackham, Eileen McCracken, some history of Irish woods. Even the Wilding book, Isabella Tree's book, that's been very popular this year. There's a lot of interesting stuff in that. I can actually nearly see my bookshelf here, but I can't quite read the title. I will do up a reading list though. Otherwise, observe, get out and watch what livestock are doing when they're left to their own devices.
Sean.
Yeah, I suppose, Imogen, you've had a really good perspective for the last 10 years on we'll say, variations on Irish forestry. And if you were advising people, farmers or whatever it was, who maybe were willing to or were considering agroforestry, like as Ella said to me earlier, dipping the toe in the water to start, maybe small enough that is not going to impact on eligibility schemes or anything like that, is what would you suggest? Would you suggest maybe to start off with maybe an orchard like fruit, or where would you suggest to start?
Yeah, I'd suggest orchard work is a great one. Try and figure out where the farm orchard was, if there was one. Hedgerows, always hedgerows. If you've got a hedge, look after it. Plug in your gaps. Think about laying it. Or plant a new hedge back in where there was an old one that was clearly there on the maps. Is always worth doing. Otherwise, a handful of trees, 50 trees scattered across a big field. You're not going to do any harm that way, and you'll learn so much from trying to get those trees going. It's so, you know, we have landowners who've never planted a tree. They come to us, they take 10 trees. The next year they come back for 20. And then they might take 20 or 25 trees every year. You know, we've come back every year now for 9 years. It's about small steps and really observing as you go and learning on the job a little bit. But hedging orchards, certainly best place to start.
Okay, sorry, I was going to say, and on that point, you mentioned hedgerows. You know, you take, we'll say, particularly maybe west and northwest of Ireland, where field boundaries are small. In reality, are they the agroforestry of the west of Ireland? Because sometimes, because of low light issues and stuff like that, there may not be much scope for planting within the field.
Yeah, I think they are. Hedgerows, as far as I'm concerned, are the agroforestry of Ireland as it stands. And you can do so much, even just messing with them, letting them grow up for a year or two. Get on YouTube, lay a little bit of hedge, learn from it, or plant up a very gappy hedge. Electric fencing these days is a godsend if you're able to mind it every day. You can protect new growth very cheaply. I think it's absolutely the way to go, and we already have it. We understand about hedgerows. Farmers know hedgerows. They feel at ease with the idea of working with them. I think that great phrasing there. You know, the agroforestry of the West. If that's all we do is keep our hedgerows in the West, it would be really, really good.
And finally, can you speak a bit to the the intensive farmers out there in Ireland, the intensive dairy farmers down the south and the southeast, the intensive tillage farmers as well, who are in a system that demands productivity, and are understandably concerned, nervous about changing that system because of productivity issues. How can they dip their toe in the water in a way that is safe and reasonably, considered when it comes to risk?
Oh, God, I sound like a broken record. Hedgerows again. If for every wire fence in a dairying system we had a hedgerow, and it doesn't need to be a big, massive, wide hedgerow, just a double line. Most dairy systems are fenced with single row barb or electric tape. There's no real fencing costs. Just to take out a metre width, fence it, stick in a hedgerow, do 50 yards 1 year or 10 yards, build on it year by year, and just feel the way that shade comes, and you'll suddenly find in 10 years' time you've got your cattle shoveled up underneath it, loving the shade or sheltering from a rainy morning. I couldn't advocate enough for hedgerows as the sort of entry point for agroforestry.
Super. Imogen, thank you so much. It's been a delight to hear you talk, and thanks for answering all the questions. How can people follow you? Are you on social media?
No, I'm awful.
You're a wise woman.
Completely missing in action.
Can people follow your progress in any way, or any of your? I mean, it's treesontheland.com, isn't it?
Yeah, they can send me an email. Like that's. I try to manage my emails quite well. Watch this space. Maybe we'll write a book or something. But no, I'm not on social media, and nor is the project at the moment, because we don't have the manpower to manage it. But maybe soon.
And also, just to say, Imogen is one of our main contributors going to be on the Irish Agroforestry Forum, so we can always contact her through that forum anyway.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah, ask them about that.
Thanks a million, Imogen. Take care.
Thank you.